Kia ora. This Sunday is Refugee Sunday, and the blessing I wrote for today: may we all be blessed with home, a place, a space, a still point, a family, a friendship, a fellowship, a door that will always be unlocked, a familiar feel and smell, where our heart is safe, where we have nothing to prove, where we welcome visitors, and where we know the God we breathe. May all know the blessings of home. The readings for today from Genesis 21 verses 8 to 21 and Matthew 10 verses 34 to 39 can be read as reflections on home. As I said last Sunday, Ishmael and his mother Hagar in the Genesis reading were unjustly cast out of their home, home being the tents of the patriarch Abraham. Hagar, being an Egyptian and a slave, had experienced the absence of home and the presence of injustice before. The matriarch Sarah is portrayed as being in charge, as if women were ever in charge in these patriarchal stories, and worried that the status of her son Isaac would be secondary to Hagar's son Ishmael, which his status was, of course, since Ishmael was the firstborn. So Sarah tells Abraham to cast him out, since Abraham, seemingly wanting to keep the domestic peace, obeys. And the God character goes along, embedding the injustice. The weave of exclusion from home due to status, fear, race, and injustice are all here in this story. Ishmael and Hagar become refugees. The Gospel reading from Matthew is also about home. The text about Jesus bringing division within the household has long vexed Christians. It reflects the thinking of the late first century Jesus movement and is based on a text from Micah 7 verses 5 and 6 about sons dishonoring fathers and daughters standing up against mothers, which the Micah text disparaged. In Mediterranean societies, a person's primary loyalty was to blood relatives, especially parents. The failure to honor parents meant the loss of face, of honor, and led to ostracism. So saying like this challenges social and religious practices to their very core. The patriarchal household, claimed since Aristotle to be central to any city or state, a microcosm of empire, is undermined by this text. The Jesus movement used the phrase, "take up your cross," to talk about dying to the old loyalties and commitment to the new Jesus household and its practices. Similarly, sword was a metaphor for the radical severing of those ties. There is no evidence of Jesus' followers, at least in the first century, advocating armed conflict. As for what the Jesus household and its loyalties might have looked like, here is the Aussie Bible translation of Luke 5:29 and 30. Then Matt Levi turned on a humdinger of a barbie on his front veranda, and all his mates from the tax office were there getting stuck into the snags and tomato sauce, along with Jesus and his mates. So the lawyers all got snide and yelled out, "Why are you hanging around with that bunch of sharks?" The dining stories about Jesus point to the values and structure of the early post-Easter Jesus movement. Chiefly, they challenged the predominant understanding of purity. The labels clean and unclean, or righteous and sinner, were used to keep people apart and to keep the pure feeling pure and the impure feeling impure. Jesus deliberately mixed it up, eating with both. Scandalously, he broke bread with the sinner Levi and other tax collectors, the sharks. He allowed a disreputable woman to wash his feet. He was accused of eating with gluttons and drunkards. By dining with so-called sinners, Jesus made himself one. He became contaminated like the sharks, the sick, and the scandalous. By dining with sinners, he challenged society's whole notion of sin. But these table stories of inclusion and parables of a similar recipe, like the great banquet, also alert us to the nature of the new home the movement was constructing. A home where outcasts were welcome, where women were not just included but also leaders, where patriarchal family ties did not predominate, but a table fellowship, a community of equals was being coached into life. Table fellowship in the ancient world symbolized spiritual unity, and it was loyalty to this unity with the contaminated, the nuisances and nobodies, that our Matthew text today tells us was the new loyalty that took the place of patriarchal family loyalty. This was the new home, and the excluded and expendables were their brothers and sisters. Home, like I said in my blessing, is not just a physical space, but an interior space. Home is about feeling safe, feeling wanted, and being familiar with the smells and habits of that place. Home is also primarily about relationships. Home is at best a sanctuary, a sacred ground. Home is also where God is primarily experienced. In most faith traditions, the divine is largely a mystery and not containable or controllable by human power. But each faith tradition offers like access points to God. For Christians, there is the Bible and music, prayers and buildings. More importantly, though, there is dining, relationships, and our common mahi, work. All are access points into this mystery. Home is where we know we can breathe in this mystery called God, and where we know we are safe and belong. The experience of refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced persons is that many of these markers of home have gone. The house and community of one's childhood has gone. The safety and comfort of familiarity has gone. The access points for faith may also be gone. The refugee can become not only a stranger in a strange land, but strange even to themselves. One understanding of the Bible is that it is a collection of stories about home and homelessness, about wandering and finding welcome. There are big macro stories in the Bible of dislocation and relocation. There's the story of Jacob being forced by famine to relocate to Egypt, and then some generations later, due to persecution, fleeing from Egypt into the Sinai wilderness and eventually coming to Canaan. The historicity of some of the biblical texts about this, of course, is disputed. What is not in dispute is the power of the home and homelessness myth shaping the Jewish faith and Jewish ethics. As the Torah in Leviticus 19:33 says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him or her no harm. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love her or him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Another macro story in the pages of the Bible is the Babylonian exile, a reference to the invasion of the kingdom of Judah by the Babylonian Empire and the forced deportation of many Jews to Babylon. There they stayed for some 60 years until the Persian conqueror of Babylon, Cyrus the Great, allowed them to return. Interestingly, during that time of exile, the oral stories and traditions of home would take written form in the Torah. And from that time on, the written word would be very powerful for Jews, and then later for Christians, as a means of centering our faith and providing an access point to God. The prophet Zechariah, chapter 7, verse 10, writing shortly after his return from exile, reiterates the ethics of welcome. "Thus says God, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart." There is a tension between holding to the traditions and values of the past and welcoming in and inviting those of other values and traditions. And this tension is repeated time and again in cultures, faiths, and nations. We want to be hospitable to refugees, but we don't want to change too much. Our leaders and politicians want to get the balance right, but usually they err on the side of those who want to protect the status quo or are frightened of what change might be required. Jesus is a politician's and a Christian's nightmare. Home for the adult Jesus was not Nazareth or Capernaum or Jerusalem. Home was in the Mahi, the mission of God, symbolized by inclusive fellowship and the ethic of compassion. And that Mahi was the work, often the hard work, of including the ostracized, the sick, foreigners, refugees, even the enemy, into the home of faith. Let's always remember the church is not primarily an institution or a set of beliefs or even a place of worship. It is primarily an inclusive table fellowship, inviting in the excluded, being transformed by such inclusion, and continuing to be a sanctuary, a home for all on the margins of society. Truly a sacred place. Blessings to you.